In this podcast episode, Helen Andrews shares her insights on how the increasing presence of women, particularly women of childbearing age, in the workforce has transformed various institutions in ways that may threaten the stability of society. She explores the demographic feminization of institutions and its connection to the rise of wokeness, declining birth rates, legal frameworks affecting gender representation, and the broader cultural and social consequences. Helen also discusses differences in male and female behavior patterns, the impact on fields like education and media, and the complexities involved in reversing or managing these trends. Helen Andrews argues that a critical mass of female employees in institutions has led to a distinct behavioral shift, often labeled as wokeness. Unlike ideology, she contends that wokeness arises naturally from feminine patterns of interaction, which tend to emphasize consensus, empathy, and managing relationships over rigid adherence to rules and facts. This explanation sheds light on why wokeness surged dramatically around 2020, coinciding with numerous professions and organizations becoming majority female. She points to law schools, medical schools, the New York Times, and broader white-collar workforces as key examples that shifted female in recent years, creating environments where the feminine approach to conflict and decision-making dominates, leading to a focus on feelings and inclusion that can become intolerant of dissent. Helen discusses psychological research illustrating that although girls and boys engage in conflict equally, females tend to express conflict through social and verbal means, like exclusion or reputation damage, rather than physical confrontation. This difference explains some of the social dynamics in feminized institutions, where protecting vulnerable groups, often framed as babies or those needing care, can become a tool for political and social control. This dynamic underpins many woke practices, where claims of victimization and emotional offense override objective debate. Helen connects this to Darwinian evolutionary impulses, suggesting women's caregiving instincts are co-opted into maintaining power structures under the guise of care and protection. A pivotal example used to illustrate the rise of wokeness and feminine modes of conflict is the 2005 controversy surrounding Larry Summers, then Harvard president. Summers made remarks attributing the underrepresentation of women in hard sciences partly to innate differences in aptitude and preferences, sparking outrage expressed through emotional reactions rather than academic debate. This event, Helen emphasizes, was an early instance of workplace cancellation without substantive discussion, where offense became the decisive factor. Summers' blunt communication style and history of controversial statements made him a ready target, but Helen highlights that the unwillingness to debate his points on merit has set a lasting precedent. Helen explains how laws intending to eliminate gender discrimination have created powerful incentives for institutions to hire and promote women beyond meritocratic considerations. She recounts the famous Sears case, where statistical disparities in job roles were challenged legally despite women's expressed preference for certain positions. Such laws make it risky for businesses to resist gender parity demands. Additionally, Helen points out that statements about biological or aptitude differences can trigger legal liability and lead to firings, as happened in notable tech and media controversies. This legal framework, according to her, adds a thumb on the scale that accelerates feminization, which she predicts might recede if affirmative action and similar policies were rolled back. The channeling of large numbers of women into careers often coincides with declining birth rates, posing what Helen calls a civilization-threatening problem. She notes how women's priorities tend to shift toward family once they have children, usually becoming more conservative and less engaged with political activism like wokeness. However, the intensive involvement of women in the workforce has contributed to fewer births and a demographic crisis. Helen expresses concern that these demographic changes in women's roles and fertility are unprecedented in human history and carry grave societal consequences. Universities receive special attention because they act as crucibles for ideological formation and have become highly feminized. Helen recounts how campuses often prioritize social justice and identity politics, creating environments where conformity and victimhood narratives are mandatory. She highlights incidents where new students are required to publicly disclose their perceived oppression, signaling a shift away from intellectual debate toward enforced emotional conformity. The example of a student meltdown at a college master's Halloween email illustrates the emotional intensity and lack of tolerance for dissent in these settings. Helen contrasts the feminized, consensus-seeking environments with traditionally masculine modes of engagement that prioritize fact, conflict, and toughness as tools to pursue truth. She acknowledges that media, especially new media and podcasting, is often dominated by men, but suggests these platforms pursue a mixture of entertainment, audience growth, and truth rather than truth alone. While masculine environments can be competitive and combative, Helen argues that they often generate more dynamic debates and learning opportunities compared to feminine spaces where harmony and politeness may hinder rigorous discussion. Helen distinguishes institutions that are mission-driven from those that become process-driven as feminization increases. Startups, typically male-dominated and focused on singular goals, may thrive due to intense mission orientation. In contrast, larger feminized institutions tend to emphasize process, conformity, and social harmony, which she believes often hampers innovation and effectiveness. She cites veterinary medicine as an example of a feminized field where this shift may not be problematic, but argues that in areas like universities, law, and media, process-driven approaches obstruct the fundamental missions of truth-seeking and justice. Helen suggests that reversing or tempering the feminization trend will not be easy given the legal and cultural structures in place. One approach she advocates is ending affirmative action-style interventions that prioritize gender diversity over merit or demonstrated discrimination. She also calls for renewed commitments to academic freedom and intellectual diversity, creating safe spaces within fields for men to operate according to masculine norms without ostracism. Helen expresses optimism that societal pressures, such as women's expressed preferences for part-time work after childbirth, will help restore some balance if policies reduce obstacles like the two-income trap. Helen is skeptical that wokeness will disappear soon, believing it is entrenched in demographic shifts rather than merely ideological fashions. She warns that moral panics similar to those surrounding 2020's peak wokeness could recur as long as institutional feminization remains dominant and open rational debate diminishes. Social media's design, which rewards sensationalism and hysterical outrage, further entrenches this dynamic, making moderating or rolling back wokeness more difficult without structural change. Throughout the conversation, Helen emphasizes that declining birth rates are perhaps the most overlooked and urgent societal challenge. She urges broader discussion on this topic, connecting it to the demographic trends that created the feminization of institutions. The combination of women's career participation and societal changes has contributed to birth rates falling below replacement levels, threatening long-term demographic stability and, by extension, civilization itself. Helen reflects on how female social cognition categorizes people into babies, caregivers, and enemies, shaping interpersonal dynamics and institutional cultures. She notes that minorities and women are often cast into the baby category, deserving care and protection, which explains the dynamics of identity politics and the zero-tolerance approach to dissent among these groups. This perspective elucidates the kind of social sorting that underpins much of the modern cultural conflicts around equity and power. She laments the decline of the maverick or individualist voices within institutions as feminist-driven social dynamics promote conformity and punish eccentricity or opposition. This elimination of outspoken, non-conforming personalities, especially male ones, reduces innovation and progress in fields such as science, journalism, and business. Helen recounts examples such as public shaming of accomplished individuals for trivial offenses as illustrative of how wokeness targets and silences valuable contributors. Helen points out how feminized institutions become self-reinforcing as men find them alienating and exit, and the remaining female-majority culture becomes increasingly exclusionary and intolerant of masculine norms. This dynamic, combined with legal and societal pressures, drives an accelerating feminization cycle difficult to stop without intentional interventions. Helen highlights the uncertainty surrounding the effects of affirmative action programs, especially regarding race and gender. Using the example of Harvard's Supreme Court case on race-based admissions, she notes that the consequences of removing such programs are not well understood and remain subject to speculation. She sees this lack of clarity as part of the challenge in reforming institutional demographics responsibly. Toward the end, Helen considers the difficult question of how society can provide men and women equal opportunities in the workforce and society without forcing either sex to abandon their masculinity or femininity. This concern underscores the broader theme of respecting genuine gender differences while navigating the socio-political realities institutions now face.